In the unforgiving plains of 1880s Wyoming, Bo Callahan, a wealthy but solitary cattle baron with a haunted past, sends $500, an unheard-of sum, through an ad in the Chicago Gazette requesting a mail-order bride. He doesn't want love. He wants an heir, a quiet partner, someone to manage his grand but joyless estate after years of silence and shadows. When Clara Whitmore steps off the dusty train, she's not what anyone expected. Slim, bookish, and carrying nothing but a leather journal and an old violin. Clara isn't running from scandal or seeking wealth. She's running from grief, with secrets stitched into every seam of her dress. Bo is cold, formal, bound by a quiet code of control. He gives her a room, a stipend, and a contract. "This ain't a courtship," he tells her. "Just an arrangement." But Clara doesn't see the ranch as a transaction. She sees broken men, overworked, ranch hands and children from nearby homesteads who wander hungry. Without permission, she starts teaching the local children letters and lullabies. She plants wildflowers around the graves of Bo's family. But what secret did Clara discover that would change everything between them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a canvas of pale morning sky, where the wind carried stories across miles of grassland that had witnessed the rise and fall of dreams. Here, in the shadow of the Medicine Bow Mountains, stood the Callahan Ranch, a sprawling testament to one man's determination to carve prosperity from an unforgiving land. Bo Callahan had built his empire with calloused hands and an iron will, transforming thousands of acres into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. The main house rose from the prairie like a fortress of weathered stone and timber, its wraparound porch offering a commanding view of rolling pastures where Hereford cattle grazed in contentment. Smoke curled from the bunkhouse chimney, where a dozen ranch hands began their day before dawn, their movements precise and purposeful under the watchful eye of their employer. At 38, Bo possessed the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His shoulders bore the weight of responsibility with quiet dignity, and his dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences most men never faced. The lines around those eyes had been carved not by laughter, but by loss, deep furrows that mapped a journey through grief that had left him changed, hardened, yet somehow more human for the breaking. The ranch had not always been a place of such somber efficiency. Once it had echoed with laughter, with the gentle voices of women who understood that a house needed more than sturdy walls to become a home. But that was before the fever took them, before his parents and young wife succumbed to the scarlet fever epidemic that swept through the territory like wildfire, leaving behind a man who had learned that love was a luxury he could no longer afford. In the years that followed, Bo had thrown himself into building his fortune with single-minded determination. The Callahan brand became synonymous with quality beef throughout the territory and beyond. Railroad contracts filled his coffers, and his reputation for fair dealing, though stern, earned him respect in Denver's business circles. Yet for all his success, the house remained eerily quiet, its rooms filled with furniture draped in dust covers as if waiting for inhabitants who would never return. His foreman, Jake Morrison, had worked the ranch for 15 years and understood his employers' moods better than most. A grizzled man in his 50s, with hands like leather and a heart softer than he cared to admit, Jake had watched Bo transform from a young husband full of dreams into a solitary figure who treated human connection like a business transaction. "Boss ain't mean," Jake often told the newer hands when they commented on Bo's distant manner. "He's just careful. Man's been hurt deep, and he ain't keen on letting it happen again." The neighboring homesteaders knew Bo as a fair but exacting neighbor. He never cheated on boundary disputes, always paid his debts promptly, and would lend a hand during harsh winters or medical emergencies. But he kept his distance, conducting even acts of kindness with the same businesslike efficiency he applied to cattle sales. It was this calculated approach to human relationships that led him to place the advertisement in the Chicago Gazette. He needed an heir, someone to carry on the Callahan name and inherit the empire he had built. A wife was a practical necessity, nothing more. He had specified his requirements clearly. A woman of good health and moral character, educated enough to manage household accounts, strong enough to survive frontier life, and intelligent enough to understand that theirs would be a partnership of convenience, not romance. The responses had been predictable. Letters from women seeking escape from poverty, widows looking for security, and young girls dreaming of adventure. He had dismissed most without a second thought. But one letter had caught his attention, written in a careful hand that spoke of education and refinement, yet bearing an underlying sadness that resonated with his own guarded heart. Clara Whitmore had written simply and honestly. She was 26, unmarried, with nursing experience gained during her time caring for wounded soldiers, returning from various conflicts. She sought not romance, but purpose, not wealth, but the chance to make herself useful in a world that had taken much from her. She asked for little beyond basic necessities and the freedom to contribute meaningfully to the household and community. Something in her letter's restrained dignity had appealed to him. Here was a woman who seemed to understand that life was about endurance rather than joy, about duty rather than desire. The $500 he offered was more than generous. Most mail-order bride arrangements involved far smaller sums, but he could afford generosity, and he respected her honesty. When the telegram arrived, confirming her acceptance and travel arrangements, Bo felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. He was getting what he wanted, a suitable partner for a practical arrangement. Yet as he stood on the train platform in Laramie, watching the locomotive approach through clouds of steam and smoke, he wondered if he was making a mistake. Clara Whitmore stepped from the train car with quiet grace, her dark traveling dress simple but well made, her posture erect despite what must have been a grueling journey. She was not the robust frontier woman he had expected, nor the desperate spinster he had half feared. Instead, she possessed a refined beauty that spoke of cities and culture, of drawing rooms and literary societies, things that seemed impossibly foreign in this harsh landscape. She carried little, a worn leather traveling bag, a violin case that had seen better days, and a leather journal clutched protectively against her chest. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, as if she were trying to make herself as unremarkable as possible. But there was something in her green eyes, a depth of intelligence and, yes, sadness, that made her anything but ordinary. Mr. Callahan. Her voice was soft but clear, educated without being affected. When he nodded, she extended a gloved hand with the same formality she might use to greet a business associate. "I am Clara Whitmore. Thank you for meeting me." The ride back to the ranch passed largely in silence, both of them seemingly content to observe the landscape and process the reality of their situation. Clara's eyes took in everything: the vastness of the sky, the hardy vegetation that clung to life in this demanding environment, the distant mountains that promised both beauty and danger. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said finally, and Bo wasn't sure if she meant the land, the responsibility, or the loneliness that stretched as far as the horizon. When they reached the ranch, he showed her through the house with the same efficiency he might use to inventory cattle. The parlor, dining room, kitchen, and library on the ground floor, the master bedroom which would remain his, the guest room which would be hers, the small study where she could handle correspondence and household accounts. "I've arranged for Mrs. Patterson from town to come out twice a week to help with cleaning and laundry," he explained, his tone businesslike. "You'll have an allowance for personal needs and household expenses. I expect meals served promptly, the house kept in good order, and assistance with ranch correspondence when needed." Clara nodded, her expression giving away nothing of her thoughts. "And children, Mr. Callahan. You mentioned in your letter that you hoped for an heir." The directness of her question caught him off guard, though he appreciated her practical approach. "In time, Mrs. Callahan, when we've both adjusted to the arrangement." It was only after he'd said it that he realized he had already begun thinking of her by his name, though they had not yet been formally married. The ceremony would take place the following day in town, a simple civil proceeding that would make their union legal, if not romantic. That evening, as Clara settled into her room and he retreated to his study with a glass of whiskey and a stack of ranch ledgers, Bo wondered what he had set in motion. Through the window, he could see lamplight glowing in her room, and occasionally the soft sound of her violin drifted through the walls. Melodies he didn't recognize, but that stirred something in his chest he thought he had buried years ago. Clara. Whitmore had come to his ranch, as he had requested, a practical solution to a practical problem. But as he sat alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his solitary success, Bo began to suspect that nothing about Clara Whitmore would prove to be as simple as he had hoped. The civil ceremony in Laramie had been as brief and impersonal as Bo had intended. Judge Harrison, a weathered man who had seen his share of frontier marriages both passionate and practical, conducted the proceedings with efficient dignity. Clara wore the same dark traveling dress, having brought no special attire for the occasion, while Bo stood beside her in his best Sunday suit, both of them treating the exchange of vows like the signing of a business contract. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Harrison had said with a slight smile, but Bo had simply nodded to Clara and shaken her hand, sealing their arrangement with the same formality that had brought them together. Now, 3 days into their marriage, Clara moved through the house like a ghost, learning to inhabit new quarters. She was efficient and unobtrusive, preparing meals that were simple but well-seasoned, maintaining the household with quiet competence, and asking no questions about the rooms that remained locked or the photographs that had been turned face down. On various surfaces, it was on the 4th morning that Clara made her first unauthorized decision. She had risen early, as had become her habit, and stepped out onto the back porch to watch the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The air carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle, but as her eyes swept across the landscape, they settled on something that made her heart constrict with familiar pain. Behind the house, perhaps 100 yards distant, stood a small fenced area that was clearly a family cemetery. Even from this distance, Clara could see that the graves were neglected, the wooden markers weathered and leaning, the ground around them choked with weeds and buffalo grass. It was a place that spoke of love, abandoned to grief, of memory too, painful to tend. Without conscious decision, Clara found herself walking toward the cemetery, her feet following a path that must once have been well worn, but now showed little evidence of recent passage. The gate hung on rusted hinges, and she had to lift it to swing it open without scraping the ground. There were 4 graves. The headstones, carved from local sandstone, bore simple inscriptions that told the story of Bo's losses in stark, heartbreaking detail. Margaret Callahan, beloved wife, taken at 24. Thomas and Mary Callahan, his parents, who had died within days of each other. And a smaller stone that made Clara's breath catch, baby Callahan, lived one day. She knelt beside the graves, her hands moving almost without her conscious direction to pull away the worst of the weeds, to straighten the wooden crosses that had been placed beside the stone markers. As she worked, tears she hadn't expected began to fall, not just for these strangers she had never known, but for all the loss that seemed to permeate this place, for the grief that had carved such deep lines. In her husband's face, Clara had experience with grief. She had nursed enough dying patients, had sat beside enough deathbeds to understand the weight of sorrow that could crush a human spirit. But she also knew something that Bo seemed to have forgotten, that love honored is love that endures, and that the dead deserve better than to be abandoned to weeds and neglect. She worked for 2 hours, clearing the graves with her bare hands, straightening the markers, and removing the debris that had accumulated over what must have been years of avoidance. When she finished, the cemetery looked less like a place of abandonment and more like what it was meant to be, a place of rest and remembrance. The next morning, Clara rose even earlier and walked into the countryside surrounding the ranch. Wyoming in late spring offered a surprising variety of wildflowers for those who knew where to look, and Clara's experience nursing in various locations had taught her to appreciate the healing power of beauty in the darkest places. She gathered armfuls of Indian paintbrush, their red blooms bright as flame, along with delicate columbines and sturdy black-eyed Susans that grew in the protected areas near the creek. Wild roses, their pink petals soft as silk, completed her collection. She arranged them carefully in mason jars filled with creek water, creating simple but elegant bouquets that she placed on each grave. It was there that Bo found her on the 3rd morning of her unauthorized project. She was kneeling beside his wife's grave, adjusting a bouquet of prairie roses, when his shadow fell across the headstone. Clara looked up to find him standing at the cemetery gate, his face a mask of controlled fury that made her stomach clench with apprehension. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was quiet, but Clara had learned to recognize that particular tone of controlled anger from her years of dealing with grieving families. It was the voice of a man whose pain had been disturbed, whose carefully constructed walls had been breached without permission. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands and skirt, meeting his gaze with the same steady calm she had used. To face down angry relatives and difficult doctors. "I was tending the graves, Mr. Callahan. They seemed to need attention. I didn't ask you to tend them." Each word was carefully measured, as if he were afraid that raising his voice might unleash something he couldn't control. "I didn't give you permission to come here." "You're right," Clara said simply. "You didn't, but they're your family, and they deserve better than to be forgotten." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Clara saw something flicker in Bo's eyes, pain perhaps, or fury, or something deeper that he wouldn't let her see. He stepped into the cemetery, his boots making no sound on the soft earth, and for a moment she thought he might physically remove her from the sacred ground. "You don't know anything about my family," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. "You don't know what they meant to me, or what I've lost, or how I choose to remember them." "You're right again," Clara replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know them, but I know grief, Mr. Callahan. I've sat with it, nursed it, watched it heal and watched it fester, and I know that love doesn't honor itself by turning away." Bo stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words, too bitter to swallow. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "This arrangement we have, it's got boundaries, Mrs. Callahan. You keep house, you manage the domestic affairs, you fulfill your duties as my wife when the time comes. But this," he gestured toward the graves, "this is private, this is mine, and you stay away from it." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a settling of resolve that she recognized from her nursing days when she had to make difficult decisions about patient care despite family objections. She had not come to this ranch to be a silent housekeeper who ignored the pain around her. She had come to fulfill a promise, though Bo didn't know that yet. "I understand your feelings, Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "but I won't stop tending these graves. Your family deserves better than neglect, and so do you." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Clara saw the exact moment when Bo's carefully maintained control began to crack. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing quickened, and the mask of businesslike distance slipped enough to reveal the raw pain beneath. "You think you know what I deserve?" His voice rose slightly, the first time she had heard him raise it. "You think 3 days of marriage gives you the right to make decisions about my private grief? I think 3 days of seeing you avoid this "A place like it might kill you gives me the right to care," Clara replied, her own voice strengthening. "I think watching you lock away every photograph, every memory, every trace of the people who loved you gives me the right to wonder if you're honoring them or hiding from them." It was then that Clara saw the children. 3 small figures had appeared at the edge of the ranch property, drawn perhaps by the sound of raised voices or simply by curiosity about the new woman at the Callahan place. They stood at the fence line like wild creatures ready to bolt, their clothes patched and too small, their faces bearing the gaunt look of children who didn't always know where their next meal was coming from. Clara recognized them immediately for what they were: homesteader children, probably from one of the struggling families that dotted the territory around the more successful ranches. Their parents would be fighting drought, locusts, harsh winters, and the constant threat of crop failure, with little time or resources to spare for anything beyond basic survival. The sight of them shifted something in Clara's heart, awakening. Instincts that had nothing to do with her arrangement with Bo and everything to do with who she was at her core. Without thinking, she raised her hand in a gentle wave. "Hello there," she called softly, not wanting to startle them into flight. The children exchanged glances, clearly torn between curiosity and caution. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 10 with strawberry blonde braids, took a tentative step forward. "Ma'am?" she said, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "Are you the new Mrs.?" "I am," Clara replied, moving slowly toward the fence. Behind her she could sense Bo's tension, but she ignored it. "What are your names?" "I'm Sarah," the girl said, gaining confidence. "This here's my brother Tommy, and that's little Beth. We live over yonder." She pointed toward a distant smudge of smoke that marked another homestead. "It's nice to meet you," Clara said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Callahan." She could see now that the children were indeed hungry, not starving but bearing the lean look of youngsters, whose families stretched every meal as far as it would go. Their eyes kept drifting toward the house, probably wondering if the kitchen might yield something to fill their bellies. "Are you hungry?" Clara asked gently. The children exchanged glances, again, clearly wanting to say yes, but having been taught not to beg. Finally, little Beth nodded solemnly, her thumb finding its way to her mouth. "Well then," Clara said, her decision made, "I was just about to bake some bread. Would you like to help me?" "Clara." Bo's voice behind her was a warning, but she didn't turn around. "I think your husband might not want us to," Sarah said with the wisdom of a child who had learned to read adult moods for survival. Clara finally turned to look at Bo, her green eyes meeting his dark ones with quiet determination. "Mr. Callahan is a good man," she said, loud enough for the children to hear. "He wouldn't turn away hungry children." It was a challenge and a test, and they both knew it. Bo's jaw worked silently for a moment, his eyes moving from Clara to the children and back again. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Half an hour," he said gruffly, "then they go home." But as Clara led the children toward the house, chattering about bread recipes and promising to teach them their letters if they wanted to learn, she caught sight of Bo standing alone among the graves she had tended, staring down at the fresh wildflowers with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something had shifted between them in those few charged moments. The careful boundaries of their arrangement had been tested and found wanting. Clara had declared herself unwilling to live as a silent partner in a business transaction, and Bo had been forced to confront the reality that his new wife was not the compliant housekeeper he had ordered from Chicago. As she helped small hands measure flour and taught young voices to count in rhythm with kneading, Clara felt the weight of the leather journal in her pocket, the journal that contained the letter that would explain everything, if she ever found the courage to share it. But for now, it was enough that she had declared herself. She was Clara Callahan now, not in name only, but in purpose. She would tend the graves, feed the hungry children, and slowly, carefully, try to bring life back to this place that had forgotten how to live. Whether Bo liked it or not, the bread that emerged from Clara's oven that afternoon was golden brown and fragrant, filling the kitchen with a warmth that extended far beyond mere temperature. Sarah, Tommy, and little Beth sat around the worn wooden table, their eyes wide with wonder as Clara sliced the still warm loaves and spread thick butter across the crusty surface. "My mama used to make bread like this," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a wistfulness that spoke of lean times and empty cupboards, before the drought got so bad. Clara's heart clenched at the casual way the child spoke of hardship, but she kept her voice light and encouraging. "Would you like to learn how? It's not difficult once you understand the rhythm of it." As the children ate with the focused intensity of those who couldn't take their next meal for granted, Clara found herself studying their faces, noting the intelligence that shone through their careful manners and the hunger for more than just food. These were children who craved learning, attention, the simple human kindness that their struggling families had little time to provide. "Can you read?" she asked gently, and was pleased when Sarah nodded proudly. "Some," the girl admitted. "Pa taught me my letters before things got so hard. Tommy knows some too, but Beth's still too little." "Reading is like a doorway," Clara said, settling into her chair with her own slice of bread. "Once you can walk through it, there are whole worlds waiting on the other side." It was then that Bo appeared in the kitchen doorway, his presence filling the space with uncomfortable tension. The children immediately stopped eating, their small bodies going still with the wariness of creatures who had learned to be cautious around powerful adults. "Time's up," he said quietly, but Clara caught the way his eyes lingered on little Beth, who had butter on her chin and crumbs scattered across her worn dress. "Just a few more minutes," Clara said, her tone respectful but firm. "They're not finished eating." Bo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he gave a short nod and withdrew. Clara could hear his boots on the porch boards, pacing like a caged animal. "Is he angry with us?" Tommy whispered, his young face creased with worry. "No, sweetheart," Clara said softly. "Mr. Callahan has had some sadness in his life, and sometimes that makes it hard for grown-ups to remember how to be around children. But he's not angry with you." When the children finally departed, their pockets stuffed with biscuits Clara had wrapped in clean cloth napkins, she found Bo standing by the corral, watching his horses with the kind of focused attention that suggested his mind was elsewhere entirely. "They'll be back," he said without turning around. "You feed them once, they'll keep coming back." "Good," Clara replied simply. "They should." That evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she hummed softly to herself, an old hymn her mother had taught her years ago. The sound drifted through the house like a gentle current, and she noticed that Bo lingered longer than usual in the kitchen, finding reasons to check the coffee pot or examine correspondence that could have waited until morning. The next day brought Sarah, Tommy, and Beth back to the kitchen door, this time accompanied by 2 other children from neighboring homesteads. Word had clearly spread about the kind lady at the Callahan Ranch who had bread to share and patience for young visitors. Clara welcomed them all, setting them around the table with slates and chalk she had found in the abandoned schoolroom supplies, stored in the barn. As she taught them to form their letters properly and sounded out simple words, she became aware of a presence at the kitchen window. Bo stood in the yard, ostensibly checking the chickens, but his attention was clearly focused on the gentle chaos of the impromptu lesson taking place at his kitchen table. Clara caught his eye through the glass and smiled, but he turned away quickly, as if caught doing something he shouldn't. The ranch hands, initially suspicious of any change to their orderly routine, began to warm to Clara's presence in subtle ways. Jake Morrison was the first to openly approve, tipping his hat when she brought fresh coffee to the men during their afternoon break. "Mighty fine coffee, ma'am," he said with genuine appreciation. "Been drinking Cookie's swill for so long, I'd forgotten what the real thing tasted like." Cookie was Pete Hawkins, the grizzled camp cook whose culinary efforts were more functional than flavorful. Pete himself seemed torn between offense at the implied criticism and pleasure at having someone appreciate good cooking. "Reckon I could learn a thing or two from the missus," he admitted grudgingly, Though Clara noticed, he found excuses to linger in her kitchen, watching her techniques with professional interest. The change in atmosphere was subtle, but unmistakable. The ranch hands moved with slightly less tension. Their conversations at meals became more animated, and the bunkhouse occasionally echoed with laughter that hadn't been heard in years. Clara began to understand the rhythm of ranch life, learning to time her activities around the men's schedules and the demands of cattle ranching. She discovered that Bo rose before dawn to check on the herds, that Jake Morrison had a secret fondness for wildflower honey in his coffee, and that young Billy Martinez, the newest hand, was barely 18 and homesick for his family in New Mexico. It was Billy who inadvertently revealed more about Bo's past during a conversation over fence repairs. "Mr. Callahan's always been fair to work for," Billy said, his accent softening the words with warmth. "But Jake says he used to be different. Before the sickness came through. Says he used to laugh more, used to join the hands for poker on Saturday nights." Clara absorbed this information quietly, filing it away with the growing collection of details that helped her understand the man. She had married. Bo had not always been the stern, controlled figure she knew. Grief had carved away pieces of his personality, leaving behind only the essential elements needed for survival. That evening, as had become her custom, Clara sat on the front porch with her violin as the sun set behind the mountains. The instrument was old, its wood bearing the patina of years and countless hours of practice, but its voice remained sweet and true. She had begun with simple melodies, folk songs and hymns that felt appropriate to the vastness of the landscape. But tonight, perhaps inspired by the day's small victories with the children and the gradual acceptance of the ranch hands, she chose something more complex, a piece by Bach that required both technical skill and emotional depth. The music floated across the ranch yard, reaching the bunkhouse where conversations gradually quieted as men stopped to listen, drifting to the barn where horses shifted restlessly in their stalls and settling around Bo like a net he couldn't escape. From her seat on the porch, Clara could see him through the study window, hunched over ledgers with a pen in his hand that hadn't moved for several minutes. She watched as he slowly set the pen aside and turned toward the window, his face hidden in shadow, but his posture suggesting a man wrestling with memories he'd thought safely buried. The piece built to its crescendo, demanding everything Clara had learned about coaxing beauty from strings and wood, about transforming emotion into sound that could touch hearts that words couldn't reach. As the final notes faded into the evening air, she lowered the violin and sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. When she finally rose to go inside, she found Bo standing in the parlor, his back to her, staring at a covered photograph on the mantelpiece that she had never seen uncovered. "My wife played piano," he said without turning around, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every evening after supper, she'd play while I read. Sometimes she'd sing too when she thought no one could hear." It was the first time he had voluntarily shared anything about his past, and Clara felt the significance of the moment like a weight on her chest. She remained still, afraid that any movement might break the spell and send him retreating back into silence. "The house has been quiet for a long time," he continued, still not facing her. "I'd forgotten what music could do to a place. Music as a way of bringing life back to empty spaces," Clara said softly, "even when we think we don't want it to." Bo finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "The children will keep coming," he said, but it wasn't. "Quite a question, probably," Clara agreed, "if that's all right with you." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the violin in her hands and back again. Finally, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Just don't let them interfere with the ranch work," he said, his voice gruff but lacking. "It's earlier, Edge." "Of course not," Clara replied, but inside her chest something warm and hopeful began to unfurl like a flower turning toward the sun. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara reflected on the small victories of the day. Bo hadn't forbidden her makeshift school. The ranch hands were beginning to accept her presence, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt like she might actually belong in this harsh, beautiful place. In her leather journal, she wrote, carefully, "The walls are beginning to crack just a little. Emma, your brother is still the good man you remembered, buried under all that pain. I think he might let me help him find his way back to himself." Outside her window, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle, settling for the night. Somewhere in the darkness, she knew Bo was making his final rounds, checking on his domain with the careful attention that had built his success. But tonight, for the first time, Clara felt like she was part of that domain, too. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its natural ease. Her informal school had grown to include 8 children from various homesteads, ranging in age from little Beth's, 4 years, to 14-year-old Marcus Thompson, whose family struggled to keep their wheat farm profitable in the increasingly difficult climate. Clara had transformed a corner of the large kitchen into a makeshift classroom, with slates arranged on a long wooden table and primer books she had ordered from the general store in Laramie. The children arrived each morning after completing their chores at home, eager for the rare luxury of focused attention and learning. It was during one of these morning lessons that Jake Morrison approached Clara with something resembling reverence in his weathered features. "Mom," he said, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands, "I was wondering if you might have a moment to speak private-like." Clara excused herself from the lesson, leaving Sarah in charge of helping the younger children with their letters, and followed Jake out to the porch where they could speak without interrupting the class. "What can I do for you, Mr. Morrison?" she asked gently, sensing that whatever he wanted to discuss was causing him considerable discomfort. Jake cleared his throat and stared at his boots for a moment before meeting her eyes. "Well, ma'am, it's like this. I never did learn to read proper. Can make out some words, mind you, but not enough to read a letter or a book or anything important like that." Understanding dawned on Clara's face, along with a warmth that made Jake's embarrassment seem less shameful. "You'd like to learn," she said simply. "If it wouldn't be too much trouble," he said quickly. "I know you got your hands full with the young ones, and I'm probably too old to be starting with such things. But, Mr. Morrison," Clara interrupted gently, "it's never too late to learn, and I would be honored to teach you." They arranged for Jake to join the children's lessons when his ranch duties permitted, and Clara was touched by the dignity with which the grizzled foreman approached his letters, never complaining about sitting beside youngsters a third his age or struggling with words that came easily to them. The sight of Jake Morrison bent over a slate, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he formed careful letters, seemed to work a particular magic on Bo. Clara often caught him, watching from doorways or windows, his expression unreadable, but his attention unmistakable. It was Pete Hawkins who provided Clara with unexpected insight into her husband's character during a conversation over bread dough one afternoon. "Boss ain't always been so closed off," Pete said, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle as he helped Clara knead the day's bread. "Time was, he'd join us boys for meals, tell stories, even sing sometimes when he'd had a beer or two." Clara looked up from her work, flour dusting her hands and apron. "What changed him so much, Pete? I know about the fever, but—" Pete was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. "Weren't just losing them that broke him, ma'am. Was losing them while he was away on business. He'd gone to Denver to negotiate some big cattle contracts, left his wife and folks here thinking they'd be fine for a week or two." Clara's hands stilled in the dough, her heart clenching with understanding. "Fever struck 3 days after he left," Pete continued quietly. "Spread through the ranch like wildfire. By the time word reached him and he could get back, they were all gone, been buried for 2 days already. The weight of that revelation settled over Clara like a shroud. Bo hadn't just lost his family to disease, he had lost them while pursuing the very success that now surrounded him with such hollow comfort. No wonder he struggled with guilt along with grief. "He blames himself," she said softly, and Pete nodded grimly. "Been carrying that burden for nigh on 6 years now. Throws himself into work like a man, trying to outrun his own shadow. Some of us figured he'd never let himself get close to another soul, figuring he'd just lose them too." That evening, Clara found herself studying Bo's face across the dinner table with new eyes, seeing not just the controlled reserve she had grown accustomed to, but the self-imposed isolation of a man who had convinced himself that love was too dangerous to risk. After dinner, as had become their custom, Clara settled on the porch with her violin while Bo retreated to his study. But tonight, instead of Bach or folk melodies, she chose something simpler, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, gentle and soothing, the kind of music meant to ease troubled hearts. As the melody drifted through the evening air, Clara noticed that the light in Bo's study window seemed to waver, as if he had risen from his desk and was moving restlessly about the room. When she finished the piece, she sat quietly in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. "Clara." She turned to find Bo standing in the doorway, his shoulder leaning against the frame with a casualness that was new for him. In the lamplight spilling from inside, his face looked younger somehow, less guarded. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." It was such a small thing, but Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. In the week since her arrival, Bo had thanked her for meals, for managing household tasks, for fulfilling her duties as outlined in their arrangement. But this was different. This was personal. "You're welcome," she replied softly. "I used to play for the patients at the hospital in Chicago. Music seemed to help with the pain sometimes." Bo moved to the porch railing, his hands gripping the weathered wood as he stared out at his land. "Pain," he repeated thoughtfully. "Funny how it can become such a familiar thing that you almost forget what life felt like without it." Clara remained still, sensing that Bo was working his way towards something important. In the distance, she could hear Jake Morrison's voice drifting from the bunkhouse, probably reading aloud from the primer she had given him. "Jake's been with me since the beginning," Bo said eventually. "Good man, loyal, but I never knew he couldn't read." "There's no shame in not knowing something," Clara said gently, "only in refusing to learn when the opportunity presents itself." Bo glanced at her, and she caught something in his expression that might have been rueful humor. "Is that a commentary on my educational deficiencies, Mrs. Callahan?" The slight teasing in his voice was so unexpected that Clara found herself smiling. "Well, I haven't seen you with a slate yet, Mr. Callahan." To her amazement, Bo's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. It transformed his entire face, giving her a glimpse of the man he might have been before grief carved such deep lines around his eyes. "I can read just fine." "And thank you," he said with mock dignity. "Even went to college back east before I came out here to make my fortune." "College?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you were just another rough cowboy." This time Bo's smile was unmistakable. "Harvard, actually. My father insisted on a proper education before I could inherit my share of the family business back in Massachusetts." Clara stared at him in genuine surprise. "You left Harvard and a family business to become a cattle rancher in Wyoming?" "Sometimes a man needs to build something that's entirely his own," Bo said, his voice growing serious again. "Something that can't be taken away by market crashes or family politics or—" He paused, seeming to catch himself before he revealed too much. "Or fever epidemics," Clara finished quietly. Bo's hands tightened on the porch railing, and for a moment Clara thought he might retreat back into his shell. Instead, he turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes searching her face, as if trying to read her intentions. "You ask a lot of questions, Mrs. Callahan," he said, but there was no real reproach in his voice. "I care about the answers, Mr. Callahan," she replied honestly. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch and the distant mountains. Finally, Bo cleared his throat. "The children," he said, "they're learning quickly." "They're hungry for knowledge," Clara agreed. "It's remarkable what young minds can accomplish when given the chance." "And Jake?" Clara smiled. "Jake has the determination of a man who knows exactly what he wants. He'll be reading newspapers by Christmas if he keeps up his current pace." Something in Bo's expression shifted, becoming almost wistful. "I used to read to—" He stopped abruptly, the shutters coming down over his features again. "To your wife?" Clara prompted gently. Bo nodded stiffly. Margaret loved poetry. Keats, especially. She'd sit by the fire with her embroidery while I read aloud. His voice grew so quiet, Clara had to strain to hear it. "I haven't opened a book of poetry since." Clara felt her heart ache for this man who had locked away so much of himself in his determination to avoid further pain. "Perhaps she would want you to read again," she said softly, "when you're ready." Bo looked at her sharply as if surprised by the suggestion. Then slowly some of the tension left his shoulders. "Perhaps," he said, though his voice suggested the possibility was still too difficult to truly consider. As they said their goodnights and retreated to their separate rooms, Clara reflected on the evening's conversation. For the first time since her arrival, Bo had shared pieces of himself voluntarily, revealing glimpses of education, ambition, and loss that made him more human, more real. In her journal that night, she wrote, "He's beginning to trust me with small pieces of his story. Harvard, a family business. I'm learning that my husband is far more complex than he pretends to be. The walls are definitely cracking, Emma. Your brother is still in there, just buried very deep." As she prepared for sleep, Clara could hear the soft sound of movement from Bo's room across the hall, restless pacing that suggested sleep was eluding him as well. She wondered if he was thinking about poetry, about the wife who had loved Keats, about the life he had built and lost, and built again in this harsh, beautiful place. Tomorrow would bring new lessons for the children, new small victories in Jake's reading progress, and perhaps another evening conversation that might reveal a little more of the man behind the careful control. Clara was beginning to understand that patience would be her greatest ally in winning Bo's trust. Like tending a garden in difficult soil, she would need to be consistent, gentle, and persistent. But tonight, for the first time, she felt truly hopeful that her efforts might bear fruit. The morning started like any other, with Clara preparing breakfast while the children gathered around the kitchen table for their daily lessons. But the normalcy shattered when young Billy Martinez burst through the door, his face pale with panic and his hat clutched in trembling hands. "Mrs. Callahan, ma'am," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You gotta come quick. There's been an accident at the Thompson place." Clara's blood ran cold. Marcus Thompson, one of her oldest students, lived with his family on a struggling wheat farm about 3 miles north. She had grown fond of the serious 14-year-old who helped care for his younger siblings while his parents fought to keep their farm from failing. "What kind of accident, Billy?" she asked, already untying her apron and reaching for the medical bag she had brought from Chicago. "Little Annie fell down the old well," Billy said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "They got her out, but she's hurt bad, ma'am, real bad. Mrs. Thompson's beside herself and there ain't no doctor for 50 miles. Clara's nursing training kicked in immediately, pushing aside emotion in favor of practical action. "Sarah," she said to the oldest girl in her makeshift classroom, "please take the children home for today. Tell them we'll resume lessons tomorrow." As the children scattered to their various homesteads, Clara gathered medical supplies with practiced efficiency: bandages, laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for cleaning wounds, and various herbs she had learned to use during her hospital work. "In Chicago, I'll ride with you," Billy offered, but Clara shook her head. "Take one of the faster horses and ride ahead to let them know I'm coming," she instructed. "I'll follow in the wagon with supplies." It was then that Bo appeared in the kitchen doorway, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. He had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. "I'll drive you," he said simply, already reaching for his... Had Clara felt a rush of gratitude that surprised her with its intensity. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes briefly before returning to her preparations. The ride to the Thompson farm was swift, but seemed to stretch endlessly under the weight of Clara's concern. Bo handled the horses with expert skill, pushing them to their limits without endangering the precious medical supplies bouncing in the wagon bed behind them. "Tell me about the family," he said as they raced across the prairie, his voice carrying over the thunder of hooves and wheels. "Struggling," Clara replied honestly. "The drought has been hard on their wheat crops. Mr. Thompson works from dawn to dusk just to keep them fed. Mrs. Thompson has 4 children under 10, and she's expecting another." Bo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And the little girl who fell. Annie's 6, sweet child, but curious as a cat. She probably went exploring where she shouldn't have." Clara's voice caught slightly. "The Thompsons are good people, Bo. They don't deserve this." The use of his first name seemed to surprise them both, but Bo didn't comment on it. Instead, he urged the horses to even greater speed. They found the Thompson homestead in chaos. Mrs. Thompson, heavily pregnant and pale with shock, sat on the front porch holding her injured daughter while her other children huddled nearby in frightened silence. Mr. Thompson paced the yard like a caged animal, his face etched with the helpless fury of a man watching his child suffer and being unable to fix it. Clara leaped from the wagon before it had fully stopped, her medical bag in hand. One look at Annie Thompson told her everything she needed to know. The child was conscious, but clearly in significant pain, her left arm hanging at an unnatural angle and a nasty gash across her forehead that had bled considerably. "Mrs. Thompson," Clara said gently, kneeling beside the distraught mother. "I'm here to help. May I examine Annie?" The relief in the woman's eyes was heartbreaking. "Oh, Mrs. Callahan, thank the Lord you've come. I don't know what to do. She's been crying something." Fierce and her arm, Clara's examination was swift but thorough. The arm was definitely broken, but it was a clean break that could be set properly. The head wound looked worse than it was, a scalp laceration that bled heavily but wasn't deep enough to be life-threatening. Still, both injuries required immediate attention. "She's going to be fine," Clara announced with quiet confidence, and the effect on the family was immediate. Mrs. Thompson's shoulders sagged with relief, and Mr. Thompson stopped his agitated pacing. "The arm is broken, but I can set it," Clara continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had learned during her hospital training. "The cut on her forehead needs cleaning and stitching, but it will heal without scarring if we tend it properly." As Clara worked, she became aware of Bo's presence beside her. Without being asked, he had positioned himself to help hold Annie still during the painful process of setting her arm, his large hands gentle but firm as he kept the frightened child from pulling away. "Tell me about your horses, Annie," Bo said in a voice so soft Clara almost didn't recognize it. "Do you have a favorite horse on your papa's farm?" The distraction worked beautifully as Clara carefully manipulated the broken bone back into proper alignment. Annie focused on Bo's calm voice, describing the horses on his own ranch, the way they liked to run in the early morning, how they each had their own personalities and preferences. "This is going to hurt for just a moment, sweetheart," Clara warned gently as she prepared to set the bone. "Can you be very brave for me?" Annie nodded solemnly, her small face scrunched with determination. When Clara made the necessary adjustment, the child cried out but didn't struggle, trusting in the steady hands that held her. Working together with an efficiency that surprised them both, Clara and Bo managed to set Annie's arm and construct a proper splint, using materials from Clara's medical bag and strips of cloth donated by Mrs. Thompson. The head wound required several careful stitches, but Clara's practiced hands made quick work of the task. "She'll need to keep the arm immobilized for at least 6 weeks, Clara instructed the parents as she packed away her supplies. "I'll check on her progress every few days. The stitches can come out in about 10 days if the wound heals cleanly." Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his weathered face working with emotion. "Mrs. Callahan, I don't rightly know how to thank you. We ain't got much, but whatever we have—" "Nonsense," Clara said firmly. "Neighbors help neighbors. That's what community means." But she caught the way Beau's eyes moved around the homestead, taking in the obvious signs of poverty and struggle. The house needed repairs, the barn was barely standing, and the field showed the devastating effects of repeated drought years. On the ride back to the ranch, they traveled in comfortable silence for several miles before Beau finally spoke. "It has handled that well," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "Where did you learn to set bones?" "Cook County Hospital in Chicago," Clara replied. "I worked in the emergency ward for 2 years. You see everything there. Broken bones, knife wounds, fevers, children who've been hurt or neglected." Her voice grew soft with memory. "It teaches you to think quickly and keep your emotions separate from your hands." "And the Thompsons?" Beau asked. "How bad off are they, really?" Clara sighed, appreciating his perceptive question. "Worse than they let on. Mr. Thompson's too proud to accept charity, but that family is one bad harvest away from losing everything. Mrs. Thompson shouldn't be doing heavy labor in her condition, but they can't afford hired help." Beau was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the horizon ahead. Finally he said, "What if Thompson had some work on my ranch? Light work that wouldn't interfere with his own farming, but enough to bring in a little extra money?" Clara turned to stare at him in surprise. "You'd do that?" "I need extra help during roundup season anyway," Beau said with studied casualness. "And Jake's been saying we could use another hand for fence repairs. Thompson strikes me as the kind of man who'd rather earn his way than accept handouts." "Beau," Clara said softly, and again the use of his first name seemed to create a moment of intimate connection between them. "That's very kind of you." He shrugged uncomfortably, clearly not accustomed to being praised for acts of generosity. "Just good business. A man needs reliable neighbors." But Clara wasn't fooled by his gruff deflection. She had seen the gentle way he had comforted Annie during her treatment, the careful attention he had paid to the family's obvious need. The cold, calculating businessman he pretended to be would never have noticed the Thompsons' struggles, much less felt compelled to help. That evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she found herself humming again, something she realized she had been doing more frequently since arriving at the ranch. The sound drifted through the house like a gentle current, and she noticed that Beau lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, finding reasons to stay within earshot. "The children will be asking about Annie tomorrow," she said as they sat down to eat. "Would it be all right if I took them to visit her? It might help with their lessons too. We could practice reading get-well cards." Beau nodded without hesitation. "Of course. And Clara," he paused, seeming to struggle with something. "What you did today, Margaret would have liked you." The comment was so unexpected, so personal, that Clara felt her breath catch. Beau had never before compared her to his late wife, had never suggested that the woman he had loved might have approved of his practical new arrangement. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you know." As they finished their meal in companionable silence, Clara reflected on the day's events. She had seen a different side of Beau, gentle, compassionate, protective. The walls he had built around his heart were definitely beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the man Emma had described in her letter, someone capable of deep love and genuine kindness. In her journal that night, Clara wrote, "Today I saw the man you remembered, Emma. He was there when Annie needed help, gentle with a frightened child, generous with a struggling family. I think he's beginning to remember who he used to be, before the grief convinced him that caring was too dangerous. There's hope here, more than I dared to expect." Outside her window, the Wyoming night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere in the darkness, The Thompson family was settling down to sleep with their injured daughter, safe and healing, thanks to Clara's medical skills and Beau's unexpected compassion. It had been a good day's work, the kind that reminded Clara why she had come west in the first place. Not just to fulfill a promise to a dying woman, but to use her skills and her heart to make a difference in a place that needed both. The weeks following Annie Thompson's accident brought an unexpected warmth to the ranch that had nothing to do with the approaching summer weather. True to his word, Beau had offered work to Mr. Thompson, and the proud farmer had accepted with the kind of grateful dignity that spoke well of both men. Clara watched the growing friendship between her husband and their neighbor with quiet satisfaction. During Thompson's visits to help with fence repairs and cattle management, she observed Beau's gradual relaxation around another man who understood the weight of responsibility and the fear of failure that came with providing for a family. Thompson's good hands, Jake Morrison commented one evening as they watched the two men examining a section of damaged fencing. And he ain't afraid of hard work. Boss made a good choice bringing him on. Clara smiled, pleased that Jake approved of Beau's decision. The foreman's opinion carried significant weight with the other ranch hands, and his acceptance of Thompson would make the arrangement easier for everyone involved. It was during one of Thompson's workdays that Clara made a discovery that would change everything. She had been cleaning the main house more thoroughly than usual, taking advantage of the cooler morning air to tackle some of the deeper corners that had been neglected. Her exploration led her to the attic, a space she had avoided until now out of respect for Beau's privacy. The attic was filled with the accumulation of years, trunks of clothing, furniture covered in dust sheets, and boxes of papers and personal items that spoke of lives interrupted by tragedy. Clara moved carefully among these remnants of the past, not wanting to disturb anything unnecessarily, but curious about the family history that surrounded her. It was behind a stack of ledger books that she found them, a collection of framed photographs that had clearly been removed from their places throughout the house and stored away like memories too painful to face. The largest photograph showed a family portrait taken perhaps 10 years earlier. A younger version of Beau stood behind a seated couple who were clearly his parents, the woman bearing the same dark eyes and strong jawline that marked her son, the man radiating the kind of quiet confidence that Beau had inherited. But it was the young woman standing beside Beau that made Clara's breath catch. Emma Callahan had been beautiful in the way that some women are beautiful, not through perfect features, but through the warmth and intelligence that shone from her eyes. She had Beau's dark hair but softer features, and her smile suggested the kind of person who found joy easily and shared it generously. Clara stared at the photograph for a long time, studying the sister she had nursed through her final illness, remembering the way Emma's face had lit up whenever she spoke of her brother and the ranch in Wyoming. Here was the family that fever had torn apart, the connections that grief had severed. Other photographs showed glimpses of ranch life from happier times. Beau and his father working cattle, his mother tending a garden that was now overgrown, Emma playing with a dog that Clara had never seen. There was even a wedding photograph of Beau and his first wife, Margaret, both of them young and radiant, with the kind of hope that made Clara's heart ache for what they had lost. As she carefully examined each image, Clara became aware of footsteps. On the stairs leading to the attic, she turned to find Beau standing in the doorway, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been pain. "I'm sorry," Clara said immediately, setting down the photographs with gentle, "Carrie, I was cleaning, and I found these. I didn't mean to intrude." Beau stepped into the attic, his movements careful and controlled. His eyes moved from Clara to the scattered photographs and back again, and she could see him struggling with emotions he wasn't prepared to face. "I put them up here after the funerals," he said finally, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. "Couldn't stand looking at them every day, but couldn't bring myself to destroy them either." Clara's heart ached for the pain in his voice, for the man who had loved so deeply that reminders of happiness had become unbearable. "They're beautiful photographs," she said softly. "Your family looked very happy." "We were," Bo admitted, picking up the family portrait with hands that weren't quite steady. "Emma used to say that happiness was a choice you made every morning when you woke up. She was always laughing, always finding something to be excited about. It was the opening Clara had been waiting for, though she hadn't expected it to come. Like this, surrounded by dust and memories in an attic that felt like a shrine to the past. "Tell me about her," Clara said gently, settling cross-legged on the floor in a way that suggested she was prepared to listen for as long as he needed to talk. Bo looked surprised by the request, but after a moment's hesitation, he joined her. On the floor, the family photograph cradled in his hands like something precious and fragile. "Emma was 3 years younger than me, but sometimes it felt like she was the older sibling," he began, his voice growing softer as he allowed himself to remember. "She had this way of seeing the best in everything and everyone. When I decided to leave Massachusetts and come west, most of the family thought I was crazy. But Emma understood. She said sometimes a person needed to build something entirely their own." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, recognizing the Emma she had known in those words. The young woman who had fought her illness with such grace, who had spoken of her brother with such love and understanding. "She never married?" Clara asked gently. Bo shook his head. "She had suitors back east, plenty of them. But Emma always said she was waiting for someone who could match her appetite for adventure. She talked about coming west to visit, maybe even staying permanently. But then—" His voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy with regret. "But then you got married, and she felt like she'd be intruding," Clara guessed. "Something like that," Bo agreed. "Margaret was wonderful, but she was also delicate. Not in a bad way, just she needed quiet, gentle things. Emma was like a force of nature. I think they would have loved each other given time, but Emma stayed back east to give us space to build our marriage." Clara felt the weight of the secret she carried pressing against her chest like a physical burden. Emma had spoken of this very thing during their long nights together in the hospital. The way she had convinced herself that her brother needed to focus on his new family without the complication of a sister who didn't know how to be quiet or delicate. "You missed her," Clara said, "and it wasn't a question." "Every day," Bo admitted. "I kept meaning to write more, to invite her for a visit. But ranch life is demanding, and Margaret's health was always fragile. And there was always something else that seemed more urgent." His voice grew heavy with self-recrimination. "By the time I realized how much time had passed, she was already sick." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. Emma had died believing that her brother had forgotten her, that his new life had no room for the sister who had loved him unconditionally. And Bo had been carrying the guilt of that perceived neglect for years. "Bo," Clara said softly, reaching out to touch his hand where it rested on the photograph. "I need to tell you something." He looked up at her, and Clara saw wariness flicker in his dark eyes. Perhaps he sensed that whatever she was about to reveal would change things between them irrevocably. "The reason I answered your advertisement," Clara began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. "It wasn't just because I needed a new start, or because I thought ranch life might suit me." Bo's grip on the photograph tightened almost imperceptibly, and Clara could see him preparing himself for some revelation that might shatter the fragile trust they had been building. "I knew Emma," Clara said simply, and watched as the words hit Bo like a physical blow. "I was her nurse during her final illness in Chicago. She talked about you constantly, about the ranch, about how proud she was of what you had built, about how much she missed you and hoped you were happy." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Bo stared at her with an expression of such shock and confusion that she had to resist the urge to reach out and comfort him. "You knew Emma," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. She was my patient for 3 months, Clara continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally shared the truth she had carried across half a continent. Consumption. She fought it bravely, but in the end, Clara's voice caught with genuine grief for the young woman who had become like a sister to her. Why didn't you tell me? Beau's voice was barely above a whisper, but Clara could hear the pain and betrayal threading through the words. Because she made me promise not to tell you about the illness until after, Clara said honestly. She didn't want you traveling across the country to watch her die. She said you'd had enough of watching people you loved slip away. Beau's face had gone pale, and Clara could see him struggling to process the revelation that his wife had known his sister, had been present during Emma's final days when he himself had been absent. She gave me a letter, Clara said softly, reaching into her apron pocket to withdraw the carefully folded pages she had carried for so many months. She wanted me to deliver it personally, to make sure you knew how much she loved you and how proud she was of the man you'd become. Beau stared at the letter as if it might explode in her hands. What does it say? That should come from her, not from me, Clara replied gently, offering him the pages that contained his sister's final words. But Beau, she didn't die feeling forgotten or unloved. She died knowing that her brother was a good man who had built something beautiful in a hard place, and she was proud of you every single day. As Beau took the letter with trembling hands, Clara felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The secret that had brought her west was finally shared, the promise to a dying woman finally fulfilled. But as she watched her husband's face as he read his sister's final words, Clara realized that this revelation would either bring them closer, together, or drive them irreparably apart. And for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she wasn't sure which outcome awaited them. Beau's hands shook as he unfolded the letter, and Clara watched emotions chase across his face like shadows from passing clouds. The attic around them seemed to hold its breath as he began to read Emma's familiar handwriting, her voice reaching across death and distance to speak to the brother she had loved. My dearest Beau, if you are reading this, then Clara has kept her promise to me, and you have finally learned the truth about how I spent my final months. Please don't be angry with her for keeping my secret. I made her swear not to tell you I was ill until after I was gone. You've watched enough people die, my darling brother. I couldn't bear the thought of you making that terrible journey again, only to sit helplessly by another sickbed. Beau's breath caught audibly, and Clara saw tears he was trying to suppress gathering in his eyes. His sister's words, so full of love and understanding, were hitting him with the force of revelation. I need you to know that I was never angry about the silence between us. Life got complicated after you married, and I understood why you needed space to build your new family. Margaret seemed like a lovely woman from your letters, delicate and gentle in all the ways I am not. I convinced myself that 2 strong-willed people in one household might be too much for her, so I stayed away and told myself it was for the best. But oh, Beau, how I missed you. How I missed our arguments about poetry and politics, the way you used to read to me by the fire. Your terrible attempts at teaching me to fish that always ended with both of us soaked and laughing. I missed being part of your daily life, missed knowing your thoughts and dreams and worries. Clara watched Beau's composure crumble as he read, his carefully maintained emotional walls finally giving way under the weight of his sister's love and forgiveness. Tears streamed down his face unchecked, and his hands trembled so violently that the letter rustled like autumn leaves. When I became ill, I was fortunate enough to be assigned to Clara Whitmore's care. She is extraordinary, Beau, skilled and compassionate and strong in all the ways that matter. During our long nights together, when the pain was bad and sleep wouldn't come, she would let me talk about you. I told her about the little boy who used to bring me wildflowers and claim they were rare treasures from distant lands. I told her about the young man who left everything familiar to chase his dreams in an untamed territory. I told her about My brother who could gentle a wild horse with patience and kindness, who built an empire with his own 2 hands. Bo looked up at Clara with an expression of wonder and growing understanding. You let her talk, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. All those nights you listened to her stories about me. Clara nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. She loved you so much, Bo. Every story she told, every memory she shared, it was clear that you were the most important person in her world. Clara told me she had never seen a patient fight so hard to live. Not for themselves, but for the chance to make peace with someone they loved. I fought, Bo, longer than I should have, because I couldn't bear to leave this world with things unsaid between us. But as the end grew near, I realized that the peace I was seeking couldn't come from clinging to life. It had to come from trust. So I asked Clara to make me a promise, not just to deliver this letter, though that was part of it. I asked her to go to you to see for herself the man I had described in all my stories. I wanted someone who understood the depth of your capacity for love, to witness what you had built, to see if the brother I remembered was still there beneath all that grief and isolation. Clara felt her breath catch as she realized Emma's letter was about to reveal the full scope of her plan, the dying wish that had brought Clara across a continent to this attic, to this moment of truth. I told Clara about the advertisement you had placed for a mail-order bride. Yes, my darling brother, news travels even to sickbeds in Chicago hospitals. I told her about a man who was trying to fill the emptiness in his life with a business arrangement, who had convinced himself that convenience was safer than love. Bo's eyes snapped to Clara's face, understanding beginning to dawn. She knew, he whispered. Emma knew about the advertisement. And then I asked Clara to do something that I pray you will forgive me for. I asked her to answer that advertisement, not to deceive you, but to give you a chance at the kind of love you deserve. I saw how she cared for her patients, how she brought warmth and hope to the darkest places. I knew that if anyone could remind you how to live instead of merely survive, it would be her. The letter rustled as Bo's hands began to shake harder. Clara watched him struggle to process the revelation that his sister had orchestrated their meeting, that the practical arrangement he thought he had negotiated was actually a dying woman's last gift to the brother she loved. I made her promise to tell you the truth eventually, but only after you had a chance to know her for who she really is. Clara came to you not for money or convenience or escape from scandal. She came because a dying woman asked her to, because she understood that sometimes love requires us to take extraordinary risks for people we care about. I need you to know that watching Clara prepare for this journey was like watching someone accept a sacred mission. She studied maps of Wyoming, read books about ranching, even learned some basic veterinary skills because she thought they might be useful. She wasn't coming to your ranch as a stranger seeking advantage. She was coming as someone who already cared about you because of the stories I had told. Bo looked up from the letter again, his dark eyes searching Clara's face as if seeing her for the first time. You knew everything, he said softly, about my family, about what I'd lost, about why I wanted a wife, but not love. I knew what Emma told me, Clara replied honestly. But Bo, I need you to understand, I didn't come here to manipulate you or deceive you. I came because Emma was dying. And when someone you care about asks you to check on their brother, you don't say no. By now you must be wondering about Clara's feelings in all this. Let me ease your mind on that score. She did not agree to this plan lightly. She argued with me about the ethics of answering your advertisement under false pretenses. She worried about deceiving a good man who had already suffered enough betrayal by life, but I convinced her that sometimes the greatest deceptions are the ones we practice on ourselves. You had convinced yourself that you wanted a business partner, not a wife. You had decided that safety lay in emotional distance. But I knew my brother, and I knew that what you really needed was someone brave enough to love you despite your fears. patient enough to wait for you to remember how to love in return. Clara watched as understanding and something that might have been wonder began to replace the shock on Beau's face. The pieces of their relationship were reorganizing themselves in his mind, revealing a pattern he had never suspected. I asked Clara to bring you something else, something I hope will help. You understand how much I believed in this plan. Look in her violin case, Beau. Behind the silk lining, you'll find a small wooden horse, the one Papa carved for you when you were 7, the one you gave to me when I was sad about moving away from our childhood home. I kept it all these years, as a reminder of the brother who always tried to make things better for the people he loved. I sent it west with Clara because I wanted you to have proof that this wasn't some elaborate scheme by a stranger. It was a dying sister's attempt to give her brother a second chance at happiness, carried out by a woman who understood what it meant to lose someone precious and who was brave enough to risk her own heart to honor a promise. Beau's head jerked up, his eyes finding Clara's violin case where it sat in the corner of the attic. Without a word, he rose and moved toward it, his movements careful and deliberate. Clara watched as he opened the case and felt along the silk lining until his fingers found the hidden compartment Emma had described. When he withdrew the small, carved horse, Clara saw his face transform completely. Gone was the controlled businessman, the guarded rancher who held the world at arm's length. In his place was simply a man holding a tangible piece of his childhood, a gift that proved beyond doubt that everything in Emma's letter was true. I know this revelation must be overwhelming, my dearest brother. You thought you were entering a practical arrangement, and instead you discover that you've been given a chance at the kind of love that transforms everything. I hope you won't be angry with either of us for this deception. I hope you'll see it as what it truly was. A dying woman's last attempt to ensure that the person she loved most in the world wouldn't spend the rest of his life alone. Clara has already proven her worth to you, hasn't she? Not because she's fulfilled the terms of your advertisement, but because she's brought life back to places that had forgotten how to live. She's teaching children, caring for neighbors, making music in rooms that have been silent too long. She's doing exactly what I hoped she would do, reminding you that love isn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. If you're reading this, then you already know Clara is someone special. The question now is whether you're brave enough to let yourself love her the way she deserves to be loved, not as part of a business arrangement, but as a partner in the fullest sense of the word. I'm dying as I write this, but I'm not sad. I'm hopeful, because I believe that Clara will succeed where I failed. She'll convince you that happiness isn't a luxury you can't afford, but a choice you make every single day. Live, Beau. Love freely. Build something beautiful not just with your hands, but with your heart. And when you do, know that somewhere, somehow, your sister is smiling. All my love, always and forever, Emma P.S. Ask Clara to play Für Elise on her violin. I taught it to her during our long nights together, and I think you'll understand why when you hear it. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Beau sat holding the letter and the small wooden horse, tears streaming down his face, as he processed the magnitude of what his sister had orchestrated. Clara remained still, hardly daring to breathe as she waited for his reaction to this revelation that changed everything between them. Finally, Beau looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Für Elise," he said softly. "That was the last piece my mother played before she died." Emma would remember that. Clara nodded, understanding the significance. "She taught me the melody during one of our last conversations. She said it was important that I learn it perfectly." "Will you play it?" Beau asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara retrieved her violin from its case, her hands steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. As she drew the bow across the strings, the familiar melody filled the dusty attic with a sweetness that seemed to bridge the gap between past and present, between loss and hope. As the music washed over them, Clara watched Beau's face transform once more. The last walls around his heart were finally crumbling, revealing the man Emma had always known was still there, capable of deep love, worthy of happiness, ready to risk everything for the chance at a real partnership. When the last note faded away, Beau set aside the letter and the wooden horse and moved toward Clara with purpose. He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion but steady with newfound certainty, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Are you here only because Emma asked you to come, or have you found something worth staying for on your own?" Clara looked into his dark eyes and saw not the guarded businessman who had met her at the train station, but the man his sister had described in all those midnight conversations, someone capable of extraordinary love once he allowed himself to trust. "I came for Emma," Clara said softly, "but I'm staying for you." The words hung between them in the dusty attic air, simple but profound in their honesty. Clara watched as Beau processed her declaration, seeing the exact moment when understanding settled into his features like sunlight breaking through storm. "A clouds, for me," he repeated softly, as if testing the words to see if they could be true. "For you," Clara confirmed, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not because Emma asked me to, though I would have honored that promise regardless, but because in these weeks since I arrived, I've discovered something I wasn't looking for and didn't expect to find." Beau's hands tightened around hers, his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "What did you find?" Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. After months of carrying secrets and carefully guarding her heart, she was finally free to speak the truth. "I found a man worth loving," she said simply, "someone who builds schools for children who need them, who offers work to struggling neighbors, who handles injured animals with the same gentleness he shows to frightened little girls. I found someone who reads poetry to his wife and grieves so deeply that it takes years to heal." Beau's breath caught, and Clara could see him struggling with emotions that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten how to express them. "Clara, he began, then stopped, shaking his head as if words were inadequate for what he needed to say. "You don't have to say anything yet," Clara said gently. "This is a lot to process. Finding out that your sister orchestrated our meeting, that I knew her before I ever set foot in Wyoming. I understand if you need time to think about what it all means." But Beau was already shaking his head. "I've spent 6 years thinking, Clara. 6 years analyzing every decision, controlling every emotion, keeping everyone at arm's length, because I convinced myself it was safer that way." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "Emma was right. I wasn't looking for a wife. I was looking for someone I could keep at a distance while still fulfilling the basic requirements of marriage." Clara nodded, appreciating his honesty even as it stung slightly. "And now I realize that Emma gave me something I was too afraid to ask for," Beau said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She gave me you, not as part of a business arrangement, but as a chance to remember what it feels like to build something with another person, to care about someone enough to risk being hurt again." The afternoon light filtering through the attic window had grown golden with the approach of evening, casting their intimate conversation in warm, honey-colored shadows. Clara became aware of sounds from below. Jake Morrison calling instructions to the ranch hands, horses moving restlessly in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. "The ranch," Clara said suddenly, reality intruding on the magical suspension of their revelation. "We should go down. People will wonder where we are." But Beau made no move to release her hands. "Let them wonder," he said with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "For once in my life, I want to finish a conversation that matters before duty calls me away. Clara felt her heart skip at the implication of his words. What kind of conversation? The kind where I tell you that watching you these past weeks has been like watching my ranch come back to life, Bo said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. The kind where I admit that I started looking forward to your violin playing, not just because it was beautiful, but because it meant you were staying for another night. The kind where I confess that I've been falling in love with you since the day you planted flowers on my family's graves, and I was too stubborn and scared to admit it. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Bo, I love you, Clara, he said, the words coming easier now that he'd broken the dam holding them back. Not because Emma wanted me to, not because you've fulfilled your duties as my wife, but because you've shown me that love doesn't have to be something I survive. It can be something I celebrate. Before Clara could respond, the sound of rapidly approaching horses broke through their intimate bubble. Multiple riders coming fast toward the main house. Bo's head snapped toward the window, his rancher's instincts immediately alert to potential trouble. "Stay here," he said, releasing Clara's hands and moving to look out the small attic window. What he saw made his jaw tighten with concern. "What is it?" Clara asked, moving to join him at the window. Below in the yard, 5 riders had pulled up, near the front porch. Even from the attic, Clara could see they were strangers, dusty, travel-worn men, with the hard look of those who lived by violence rather than honest work. Their horses were lathered with sweat, suggesting they had been riding hard for some time. "Trouble," Bo said grimly, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "Clara, I want you to stay up here until I find out what they want." But Clara was already shaking her head. "Absolutely not. If there's trouble, we face it together." Bo looked as if he wanted to argue, but the sound of Jake Morrison's voice calling from the yard interrupted any discussion. "Boss, you need to come. Out here we got visitors, and they ain't the social type." Bo's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Stay behind me," he told Clara, "and if I tell you to run, you run. Promise me." "I promise to use good judgment," Clara replied, which wasn't quite the same thing but would have to suffice. They made their way quickly down from the attic and through the house to the front porch, where they found Jake and several of the ranch hands standing in a loose semicircle, their postures tense, but not yet openly hostile. The 5 strangers remained mounted, their leader, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes, studying the ranch buildings with the calculating gaze of someone assessing potential targets. "Mr. Callahan," the scarred man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Clara couldn't quite place. "We heard you got yourself a new wife recently. Congratulations." There was something in the man's tone that made Clara's skin crawl, a false politeness that barely concealed darker intentions. Bo stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Clara and the strangers. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Bo said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had built his success in both business and ranching. "You are?" "Name's Donovan," the scarred man replied. "Me and my boys here are looking for someone. A woman who might have come through these parts recently. Dark hair, green eyes, calls herself Clara Whitmore." Clara felt ice form in her veins. Somehow, impossibly, her past had followed her to Wyoming. She stepped forward before Bo could stop her, her chin raised with defiant dignity. "I'm Clara Callahan," she said, emphasizing her married name. "What business do you have with me?" Donovan's smile was predatory and unpleasant. "Well now, Mrs. Callahan, seems you left Chicago owing some money to some very important people. They've asked us to collect it." Clara's mind raced, trying to understand what he could be talking about. She had left Chicago with her affairs in order, her few debts paid, her obligations fulfilled, but then understanding dawned with sickening clarity. "Dr. Brennan," she said quietly, the name falling from her lips like a curse. Donovan's smile widened. "Smart lady. See, the good doctor claims you stole some very valuable medical supplies when you left his employ. Says you cost him a considerable amount of money. That's a lie, Clara said hotly. I never stole anything from Dr. Brennan or anyone else. But even as she spoke, Clara understood the trap that had been laid for her. Dr. Marcus Brennan had been the physician in charge of the charity ward where she had worked, a man whose wandering hands and inappropriate comments had made her employment increasingly difficult. When she had finally reported his behavior to the hospital administration, he had retaliated by making her working conditions unbearable until she was forced to resign. Apparently, his revenge hadn't ended there. Dr. Brennan says otherwise, Donovan continued, clearly enjoying Clara's distress. Says you took laudanum, morphine, surgical instruments. Valuable stuff. He wants compensation plus interest. $500 ought to cover it. The exact amount Beau had paid for a mail-order bride. Clara felt sick as she realized this wasn't coincidence. Somehow, Brennan had discovered her destination and sent these men not just to collect fabricated debt, but to humiliate and destroy the new life she had built. She doesn't owe anyone anything, Beau said, his voice cutting through the charged air like a blade. You're on my land without invitation, making accusations without proof. I suggest you leave before this becomes unpleasant. Donovan's attention shifted to Beau, and Clara saw something dangerous flicker in the man's cold eyes. Now, Mr. Callahan, this is between us and your wife. You don't want to get involved in business that ain't yours. Anything involving my wife is my business, Beau replied, moving slightly closer to Clara in a gesture that was both protective and claiming. The tension in the yard ratcheted up another notch as the ranch hands shifted positions, hands drifting toward weapons they wore but hoped not to use. Clara realized they were teetering on the edge of violence, and all because of lies designed to destroy her. Beau, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. They're not here for money. They're here to hurt us. Donovan's mask of false politeness finally slipped completely. Smart and pretty. No wonder Brennan was so fond of you. His meaning was clear and disgusting, and Clara saw Beau's hands clench into fists at his sides. That's enough, Beau said, his voice deadly quiet. You have 30 seconds to get off my land before I start shooting. 5 men against, what, 8? Donovan made a show of counting the ranch hands. Those ain't bad odds, but here's the thing, Callahan. We ain't leaving without the woman. It was Jake Morrison who drew first, his weathered hand moving to his gun with surprising speed. But the strangers had been expecting trouble, and they reacted with the practiced violence of men who lived by intimidation and force. Clara, run! Beau shouted, even as he threw himself toward the porch railing to take cover. But Clara was already moving, not away from the fight, but toward the house where she knew Beau kept a rifle by the front door. If these men thought they could destroy her new life with lies and violence, they were about to learn that Clara Callahan, née Whitmore, was not a woman who surrendered easily. The showdown that would determine their future was about to begin, and Clara intended to stand beside her husband and fight for the love they had just discovered. The first gunshot shattered the evening air like breaking glass, followed immediately by the thunder of boots on wooden planks as both sides sought cover. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the front door, her fingers closing around the stock of Beau's Winchester rifle. Clara! Beau's voice carried across the chaos from where he had taken position behind the porch railing. Stay down! But Clara was already moving, checking the rifle's action with the competence of someone who had learned to handle firearms during her nursing work in rough neighborhoods. The weapon was loaded and ready, and Clara felt a grim satisfaction as she took position by the front window where she could cover Beau's flank. In the yard, Donovan and his men had scattered for cover behind water troughs and farm equipment, their horses dancing nervously as gunfire erupted around them. Jake Morrison and the ranch hands had found defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of men who had fought Indians and rustlers in years past. This is your last chance, Callahan, Donovan shouted from behind the watering trough. Send! Out the woman, and we'll ride away peaceful like. Go to hell. Beau's response was punctuated by a rifle shot that sent splinters flying from the trough's wooden edge, inches from Donovan's head. Clara felt a surge of fierce pride at her husband's defiant protection of her, even as she recognized the dangerous odds they faced. 5 hardened gunmen against 8 ranch hands was not the hopeless situation Donovan had suggested, but it would be a bloody fight that could easily go either way. "Jake!" Beau called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "Circle around behind. The barn. Billy, you and Tom cover the left flank." The foreman nodded grimly and began working his way toward better position, his movements careful and deliberate. Clara watched through the window as the battle lines formed, her trained eye assessing injuries and calculating risks with the same analytical detachment she had learned in hospital emergency wards. It was then that she spotted movement at the far edge of the property, additional riders approaching fast from the north. Her stomach dropped as she counted them. 6 more men, riding hard toward the ranch with weapons already drawn. "Beau!" she called out urgently. "More riders coming from the north!" Beau's head snapped in the direction she indicated, and Clara saw his jaw tighten as he assessed the new threat. 11 against 8 was much worse odds, especially if the newcomers managed to catch the ranch hands in a crossfire. "We need to get inside," Beau said, his tactical mind already adjusting to the changed situation. "Jake, fall back to the house." But as the foreman began his retreat, one of Donovan's men rose from cover and took careful aim. Clara saw the danger. Before anyone else, her position at the window giving her a clear view of the ambush about to unfold. Without conscious thought, Clara raised the Winchester and fired. The shot took the gunman high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild. Jake Morrison dove for cover, unaware of how close he had come to death. "Nice shooting, Mrs. Callahan," Jake called out with grim humor as he scrambled toward the porch. Clara felt no satisfaction in wounding another human being, but she felt no regret either. These men had come to her home with violence and lies, threatening the life she had built, and the man she loved. She would do whatever was necessary to protect both. The approaching riders were close enough now that Clara could make out individual features, and what she saw made her blood run cold. These weren't more of Donovan's hired guns, they were worse. The man leading them wore a badge that glinted in the dying sunlight, and Clara recognized the calculated cruelty in his face that she had learned to fear during her final months in Chicago. "It's Sheriff Hawkins," she said, her voice carrying clearly to Beau despite the ongoing gunfire. "He's one of Brennan's people." Understanding flickered across Beau's face. A corrupt sheriff would give Donovan's accusations the appearance of legitimacy, turning what should have been a simple matter of trespass into something much more dangerous. They weren't just fighting hired thugs anymore, they were fighting what appeared to be lawful authority. "Mrs. Clara Callahan," the sheriff's voice boomed across the yard as he and his men took positions that effectively surrounded the ranch house. "You're wanted for questioning regarding theft of medical supplies. In Chicago, come out with your hands raised." "She's not going anywhere!" Beau's response carried the full authority of a man defending his home and family. Sheriff Hawkins' laugh was harsh and unpleasant. "Mr. Callahan, you're interfering with lawful arrest. Stand down or face charges yourself." Clara felt the trap closing around them. Even if they won this fight, even if they drove off Donovan and his men, the presence of a sheriff, corrupt or not, complicated everything. Killing lawmen, even corrupt ones, would bring down the full weight of territorial authority on the ranch. "Beau," she said quietly, moving closer to where he crouched behind the railing, "this isn't just about money or revenge. Brennan wants me destroyed completely. He's willing to use the law itself to do it." Beau's dark eyes met hers, and Clara saw not fear, but determination burning in their depths. "Then we'll have to prove them wrong," he said simply, "and we'll do it together." The words sent strength flowing through Clara's veins like fire. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Not a business arrangement or a convenience, but two people standing together against whatever the world threw at them. I have an idea, Clara said, her mind racing through possibilities. But you're not going to like it. Tell me. I surrender, Clara said, ignoring Beau's immediate protest. But publicly, in front of witnesses, I demand they present their evidence, their warrants, their proof. Make them go through proper legal channels instead of this vigilante nonsense. Beau shook his head emphatically. Absolutely not. I won't let you put yourself in their hands. Listen to me, Clara insisted urgently. If I fight, I look guilty. If I run, I look guilty. But if I cooperate and demand proper legal proceedings, I force them to either produce real evidence, which they can't, or reveal themselves as the criminals they actually are. Before Beau could respond, the sound of additional horses approaching made them both look toward the main road. Clara's heart leaped as she recognized the riders, Mr. Thompson on his old mare, followed by 3 other neighboring ranchers and their sons. Word of trouble at the Callahan place had somehow spread, and help was arriving. But with the help came even greater complications. What had started as a private confrontation was rapidly becoming a small war involving the entire local community. This ends now, Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Sheriff Hawkins, I'll come out, but I want witnesses present. And I want to see your warrant. Clara, no. Beau grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. Trust me, she said, meeting his eyes with steady determination. I've been running from lies for months. It's time to face them head on. Slowly, Clara rose from her position by the window, her hands clearly visible and empty. I'm coming out, she announced. I want to see the warrant for my arrest, and I want these witnesses to hear the specific charges. As she moved toward the front door, Clara felt Beau's presence beside her. He had risen as well, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. If you're going out there, I'm going with you, he said quietly. Beau, that's not... We're married, Clara, he interrupted, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had built his ranch empire. Whatever happens to you happens to both of us. That's what the vows meant, even if we didn't understand it at the time. Together, they stepped onto the front porch, Clara with her hands raised, Beau with his rifle lowered, but ready. In the yard, Sheriff Hawkins and Donovan exchanged glances that confirmed Clara's suspicions about their relationship. Very wise, Mrs. Callahan, the sheriff said with false pleasantness. Now step away from your husband and come along quietly. First the warrant, Clara said firmly, and the specific charges. These witnesses have a right to know what law I'm supposed to have broken. Mr. Thompson and the other arriving neighbors had positioned themselves strategically around the yard, their presence adding a layer of legitimacy that neither the sheriff nor Donovan had expected. Clara saw uncertainty flicker across several faces as the situation became more complex than a simple arrest. You're accused of theft of medical supplies valued at over $500 from Dr. Marcus Brennan's clinic in Chicago, Sheriff Hawkins announced. Dr. Brennan has sworn out a complaint and requests extradition. Where's the warrant? Beau demanded, his voice cutting through the official-sounding words like a blade. The sheriff's hesitation was brief but telling. The warrant is being processed through proper channels. Dr. Brennan's sworn statement is sufficient for preliminary arrest. Clara felt a surge of vindication. No warrant, she said clearly, ensuring all the witnesses could hear. No specific evidence. Just the word of a man who sexually harassed his female employees and retaliated when they reported his behavior. The words carried across the yard like a thunderclap, and Clara saw several of the gunmen shift uncomfortably. Even men who lived by violence often drew lines at certain kinds of degradation. That's a serious accusation, ma'am, Mr. Thompson called out from his position near the corral. You got proof of that? Hospital records, Clara replied. Witness statements from other nurses. A formal complaint filed with the hospital administration that led to Dr. Brennan's censure. She paused, letting the implications sink in. All of which can be verified through proper legal channels if anyone cares about actual justice. The tableau held for a long moment. tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Clara could see the calculations happening behind multiple sets of eyes as everyone present tried to assess the shifting dynamics of law, justice, and personal interest. It was Donovan who broke first, his patience finally exhausted with legal niceties. "Enough talking," he snarled, raising his gun toward Clara. "We're taking her, warrant or no warrant." The movement shattered the fragile peace like breaking glass, and Clara realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her fate, but the kind of life she and Bo would be able to build together. Donovan's gun had barely cleared leather when Bo moved, his rifle coming up with fluid precision, born of years protecting his land and livestock. The sharp crack of his Winchester echoed across the yard, and Donovan's weapon spun from his hand. As the bullet shattered his wrist, the gunman's scream of pain and rage broke the spell that had held everyone frozen, and suddenly the yard erupted in chaos. But this time, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Mr. Thompson and his companions had not come unprepared for trouble. At the first sign of drawn weapons, they had positioned themselves with the tactical wisdom of men who had fought through the Indian Wars and cattle-rustling conflicts that had shaped the territory. Now they moved with coordinated efficiency that spoke of old partnerships and mutual trust. "Sheriff Hawkins," Thompson's voice boomed across the gunfire with unmistakable authority. "I'm calling for a citizen's review of this arrest. These folks got rights and we aim to see they're respected." The corrupt sheriff found himself caught between multiple lines of fire, his hired guns outnumbered and outmaneuvered by men who knew this land and fought for their neighbors rather than money. The tactical situation had become hopeless for Donovan's. "Aside! Stand down!" Hawkins shouted, but his voice carried desperation rather than authority. "This is official business." "Not without proper warrants, it ain't," came the reply from old Pete Henderson, whose ranch bordered the Callahan property. "We know the law out here, Mr." Clara watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of fierce pride and deep gratitude. These were her neighbors now, people who had accepted her, not because of any legal arrangement, but because of what she had contributed to their community. They were fighting for her because she had proven herself worthy of their protection. Jake Morrison had worked his way around behind the remaining gunman, his weathered face grim with purpose. "You boys got about 10 seconds to throw down your weapons," he called out. "After that, things get permanent-like." The mathematical reality of their situation was becoming clear, even to Donovan's hired thugs. Wounded and outnumbered, facing men who knew how to shoot and had every legal right to defend their neighbors, they began to reassess their commitment. To Dr. Brennan's money, it was one of the younger gunmen who broke first, raising his hands and carefully placing his weapon on the ground. "I didn't sign up for no war," he announced. "This was supposed to be simple collection work." His surrender created a cascade effect as 2 more of Donovan's men followed suit, leaving only the wounded leader and Sheriff Hawkins still fighting what had become an impossible battle. "Donovan!" Bo called out, his rifle trained steadily on the gunman who had threatened his wife. "It's over. Tell your boss that Clara Callahan is under the protection of this community, and any further harassment will be met with appropriate force." Donovan clutched his shattered wrist, his face twisted with pain and fury. "This ain't finished, Callahan. Brennan's got money and connections. He'll keep coming." "Then he'll keep losing," Clara said, stepping forward with her chin raised defiantly. "Because I'm not the frightened woman who ran from Chicago. I'm Clara Callahan now, and I've got family here." The words rang across the yard with quiet certainty, and Clara felt their truth settle into her bones like roots finding good soil. She was no longer alone, no longer running from lies and threats. She had found her place and her people, and she would defend both with everything she had. Sheriff Hawkins holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance, his face flushed with the humiliation of tactical defeat. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the words carried no real threat. His authority had been exposed as false, his support evaporated, and his reputation damaged beyond repair. "You're right," Mr. Thompson said mildly. "It ain't over. You'll be explaining to the territorial marshal how you came to be working with hired guns to arrest a woman without proper warrants. That should make for interesting conversation. As the defeated men gathered their wounded and prepared to retreat, Clara felt Beau's arms slip around her waist in a gesture that was both protective and claiming. She leaned into his strength, amazed at how natural it felt to share this burden with someone who understood its weight. "You all right?" he asked quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "I am now," Clara replied, and realized she meant it. Completely. The fear that had driven her west, the uncertainty that had clouded her first weeks at the ranch, the careful distance she had maintained even as her feelings grew, all of it had been burned away in the crucible of this confrontation. As Donovan and his remaining men rode away in defeated retreat, followed by the discredited sheriff, the neighbors who had come to help began to gather in the ranch yard. What had started as a crisis was transforming into something that felt suspiciously like a celebration. "Mrs. Callahan," Pete Henderson said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I reckon you handled yourself real well today. Takes backbone to face down corruption like that." "She's got sand, this one," Thompson agreed warmly. "Takes after her husband in that regard." Clara felt tears of gratitude prick at her eyes as she looked around at these weathered, practical men who had risked their own safety to defend her rights. This was what community meant on the frontier, not pretty words or social niceties, but people willing to stand together when it mattered most. "I can't thank you enough," she began. But Jake Morrison cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Don't need thanks for doing what's right," he said gruffly. "Besides, you've been doctoring our kids and teaching them their letters. Far as we're concerned, you earned your place here fair and square." As the neighbors prepared to depart, satisfied that the crisis had passed, Clara found herself alone with Beau in the gathering dusk. The ranch hands were securing the property and tending to the animals who had been spooked by the gunfire, giving the couple a rare moment of privacy. "So," Beau said, his arm still around her waist, "Clara Callahan." "Clara Callahan," she agreed, testing the way her name sounded when spoken with such warmth and acceptance. "I like it," Beau said simply. "I like the woman who wears it." Clara turned in his embrace, studying the face that had become so dear to her over these weeks of gradual understanding. The last barriers between them had been swept away by the evening's events, leaving only truth and possibility. "Beau," she said softly, "what happens now?" His smile was answer enough, warm and full of promise. "Now we build something together," he said. "Something real, something that can't be destroyed by lies or threats or the ghosts of what we used to be." As if to seal his words, Beau leaned down and kissed her, not the formal peck that had concluded their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss that spoke of love freely given and gratefully received. Clara melted into his embrace, finally allowing herself to believe that the journey that had begun with a dying woman's wish had led her exactly where she was meant to be. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against Beau's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling the last knots of fear and uncertainty unravel in her chest. "Emma would be pleased," she said softly. "Emma would be smug," Beau corrected with a chuckle that rumbled through his chest. She always did like being right about important things. As they stood together in the Wyoming twilight, surrounded by the land they would work together and the community they would serve together, Clara felt the profound satisfaction of a promise kept and a love discovered. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Laramie was gone, replaced by a woman who had found her true home in the most unexpected place. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and possibilities, but Clara faced it without fear. Whatever came next, she would meet it as part of a partnership that had been forged in crisis and tempered by truth. She was Clara Callahan now, and she was finally completely home. 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of what had once been the ranch's unused parlor, watching the transformation that love and purpose had wrought. The room now served as a proper schoolhouse, complete with desks that Bo had commissioned. From the carpenter in Laramie and a blackboard that dominated one wall, 15 children of various ages bent over their lessons, their voices creating a gentle murmur of concentration that filled the house with life. "Mrs. Callahan," young Marcus Thompson called softly, raising his hand with the careful politeness she had taught all her students. "I finished copying the poem you assigned. Would you like to check it?" Clara moved between the desks with practiced ease, her hand coming to rest briefly on Marcus's shoulder as she examined his work. His penmanship had improved dramatically. Since those first tentative lessons around her kitchen table, and his younger sister Annie, fully recovered from her fall down the well, beamed with pride at her brother's accomplishment. "Excellent work, Marcus," Clara said warmly. "Your handwriting is becoming quite elegant. Perhaps you'd like to read it aloud for the class?" As Marcus stood to recite Longfellow's The Village Blacksmith, Clara's attention was drawn to movement. Outside the schoolroom window, Bo and Jake Morrison were working with a group of new ranch hands, including several young men from struggling homesteads who had accepted Bo's offer of part-time work to supplement their family's income. Sight filled Clara with quiet satisfaction. The Callahan Ranch had become more than just a successful cattle operation. It had become the heart of a thriving community where neighbors looked after one another and opportunity was shared rather than hoarded. Mom, Sarah Henderson, now 13 and one of Clara's most advanced students, appeared at her elbow. "Dr. Patterson's here to see you." Clara looked up to see the territory's new medical examiner standing in the schoolroom doorway, his leather bag in hand and a smile creasing his weathered features. Dr. William Patterson had arrived from Denver 3 months earlier, appointed after a territorial investigation into the corruption that had surrounded Dr. Brennan's network of hired thugs and bought officials. "Dr. Patterson," Clara said warmly, dismissing her students for their afternoon recess. "How did the examination go?" The doctor's smile widened as he withdrew an official-looking document from his coat pocket. "Clean bill of health for the entire community, Mrs. Callahan. And this came through the territorial mail. The formal charges against you have been dropped completely. Dr. Brennan has been arrested on multiple counts of fraud and harassment, and his associates are facing federal charges for crossing state lines with criminal intent." Clara accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly with relief. Though she had built a secure life here in Wyoming, the shadow of false accusations had never completely lifted from her heart. Now finally, she was truly free. "There's more," Dr. Patterson continued, his expression growing serious. "The Territorial Medical Board has reviewed your credentials and nursing experience. They're prepared to offer you an official position as Territorial Medical Officer for this district, if you're interested." The offer was generous and unexpected, representing a level of professional recognition that Clara had never dared to hope for. But as she considered it, her eyes drifted to the children playing in the ranch yard, to the pregnant Mrs. Thompson resting in the shade while her toddler napped beside her, to the life she had built through love rather than ambition. "I'm honored by the offer, Dr. Patterson," Clara said thoughtfully, "but I believe my work is here. The community needs a teacher and a nurse, and I've found that I can serve both roles effectively without official titles." The doctor nodded with understanding. "I thought you might say that. You've built something special here, Mrs. Callahan. The territorial governor himself commented on the reports of your work when we discussed the medical situation in this district." As Dr. Patterson departed, Clara found herself alone in the transformed parlor, surrounded by the evidence of dreams realized and promises kept. The afternoon light streaming through windows that had once been shrouded in dust covers illuminated children's artwork on the walls, books on shelves that had stood empty for years, and photographs that Bo had finally brought down from the attic. The family portrait that had once been too painful to display now held a place of honor on the mantelpiece, no longer a monument to loss, but a celebration of love that transcended death. Beside it sat a newer photograph. Clara and Beau on their wedding day, not the hasty civil ceremony that had made their arrangement legal, but the church wedding they had celebrated 3 months later with the entire community present. Mrs. Callahan? Clara turned to find little Beth Thompson in the doorway, her small face serious with importance. "Mr. Callahan says to tell you that the new foal was born, and would you like to come see?" Clara's heart swelled with anticipation. The mare's pregnancy had been difficult, and she had been helping Beau monitor the situation for weeks. A successful birth represented not just new life on the ranch, but another small miracle in a place that had learned to celebrate such things. She found Beau in the barn, kneeling beside a chestnut mare who regarded her newborn colt with the bemused pride of new motherhood. The foal was already attempting to stand on legs that seemed impossibly long and fragile, his coat still damp from birth, but his spirit undaunted by the challenge of existence. "He's perfect," Clara breathed, settling beside Beau in the clean straw. "Look at those markings. He's going to be beautiful, like his mother," Beau agreed. But his eyes were on Clara rather than the horse. Strong, beautiful, and brave enough to take on anything. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the love in his voice, still sometimes surprised by the openness that had replaced his careful reserve. The man who had once guarded his emotions like precious secrets now shared them as freely as he shared everything else in his life. "Dr. Patterson brought word," Clara said, leaning into Beau's solid warmth. "The charges have been dropped completely. Brennan's been arrested." Beau's arm tightened around her shoulders. "It's finished then. Really finished." "Really finished," Clara confirmed, "though I don't think I would change any of it, even if I could. The journey that brought me here, the challenges we faced, they made us who we are." "Emma's plan worked better than she could have imagined," Beau said with a chuckle. "She always was too clever for her own good." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the foal's determined efforts to master the art of standing, while his mother provided encouragement and gentle nudges. Around them, the barn filled with the familiar sounds of ranch life. Horses moving in their stalls, cattle lowing. In distant pastures, the voices of ranch hands beginning the evening chores. "Clara," Beau said softly, his voice taking on the particular tone that meant he had something important to say. "I've been thinking about what you said to Dr. Patterson, about your work being here." Clara looked up at him, noting the slight nervousness in his expression. "What about it?" "I agree that your work is here," Beau said carefully, "but I was wondering if you might consider expanding it slightly." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Beau reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I know we're already married, but our first wedding was about contracts and arrangements. I'd like our second wedding to be about love and promises and the family we're going to build together." Clara stared at the ring, her heart hammering against her ribs with joy and wonder. "Beau, marry me again, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because a dying woman asked you to, not because I needed a practical arrangement, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with you." Clara's answer was lost in tears of happiness as she threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight against her heart, while the foal finally achieved his goal of standing upright, and the evening light painted everything in shades of gold. And "Promise. Yes," she whispered against his ear. "Yes to everything. The ring, the wedding, the family, the future. Yes to all of it." As Beau slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come west as Clara Whitmore, a woman running from grief and lies, carrying a dying woman's letter and a desperate hope for redemption. She had become Clara Callahan, a woman who had found her place in the world and the love of a man worth fighting for. Outside the barn, the Wyoming sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors that promised fair weather for the days ahead. Children's laughter echoed from the ranch yard, where lessons had given way to games, and the sound of Jake Morrison's harmonica drifted from the bunkhouse where the hands were settling in for another peaceful evening. The ranch that had once been a monument to solitary success had become a testament to the power of love to transform not just individual hearts, but entire communities. Clara had kept her promise to Emma, but in doing so, she had discovered something even more precious than redemption. She had found home. She had found love. And she had learned that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin not with passion and romance, but with two broken people brave enough to trust each other with the delicate work of healing. As they walked hand in hand back to the house where their students were helping to prepare dinner and their neighbors were gathering for another evening of shared fellowship, Clara smiled to think what Emma would say if she could see them now. "Thank you," she whispered to the Wyoming wind, knowing somehow that her words would find their way to the sister whose love had made all of this possible. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and anchored by the kind of love that could weather any storm. Clara Callahan was exactly where she belonged, and she intended to spend the rest of her life proving worthy of the gift she had been given. In a world built on hard bargains and uncertain dreams, she had found the one thing that could never be bought or sold, a love that transformed everything it touched, making the impossible not only possible, but inevitable.